Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're getting into, well, a really big one. It's this deep-seated clash, over a century old, between Marxism and anarchism.
Yeah, it's fundamental. And this whole deep dive really circles around the idea of power.
Mhm.
What is it? Is it something revolutionaries need?
Mm.
Or is it, inherently corrupting?
Right, because that saying, power corrupts, absolute power corrupts, absolutely, it just feels true, doesn't it? It makes intuitive sense when you look at the world.
It really does resonate. But the sources we're looking at today insist we need to go beyond that feeling. They're pushing for a more, let's say, scientific, historical way of understanding why oppression exists.
And how to actually get rid of it.
Yeah, exactly. So our goal here is to really break down the core differences in how these two perspectives see the state and, crucially, how they think change actually happens.
Okay, so let's start right there, that theoretical split. The state and what's really the root source of, well, evil, for lack of a better word.
Well, for many anarchists, it often comes down to authority itself. Power, the state, these are seen as the original sin, almost. Get rid of them, and, freedom naturally follows.
But the Marxist view flips that.
Fundamentally, the sources argue that power and the state aren't the ultimate source of the problems. They didn't just appear out of nowhere.
So if it's not the state, then what is the primary cause, according to this view?
Private property. The Marxist argument is that the state basically evolved for a very specific job, protecting the system of private property and the class divisions that come with it.
Protecting the rulers from the ruled, essentially.
Precisely. So the state is defined as, well, basically a tool. It's special bodies of armed people, laws, prisons, all wielded by the ruling class to keep the exploited classes down.
Ah, okay. So the state is more like a symptom then, a structure needed to maintain economic inequality.
That's the idea. And this is really key. If you see society is changing over time, class structures aren't fixed, racism isn't inherent, greed isn't just human nature, then the state isn't eternal either.
It serves a purpose, and when that purpose disappears,
It should wither away. That's the theory. Which brings us to the interesting part. Both Marxists and anarchists want that stateless, oppression-free society eventually.
right, they agree on the destination. So why the huge fight over the journey, over the means?
It really boils down to organization. The Marxist sources argue that to get to that stateless future, you first have to defeat the current ruling class, the capitalists. And that takes more than just local efforts or, individual acts.
It requires
Mass, organized political struggle. Workers and young people getting organized to take on the power of the capitalist class.
Okay, and this leads us straight into the really controversial bit for Marxism, right? The need to build its own political tools,
Yeah,
including something often called a workers' state.
exactly. That's the major sticking point. It follows logically from the analysis. If the capitalists have their state, their police, army, courts to defend their power and crush revolution.
Then the working class needs its own organized power to fight back and win.
Yes. Its own structures to, first, break the old state machine, and second, to defend the revolution from the inevitable attempts to overthrow it.
But hang on, the immediate pushback, and you could hear listeners thinking it, is if the state is inherently oppressive, why on earth would you create a new one? Isn't that just swapping bosses?
It's the classic critique, and the sources tackle it directly. They argue this proposed workers' state is fundamentally different. It's not about creating new class divisions. Its job is temporary.
Temporary how?
Its main function is to suppress the old ruling class, the capitalists, trying to get their power and property back. The argument is, without that kind of centralized defense, any revolution is basically doomed. It'll get crushed by counter-revolution.
Okay, so that focus on central organization, on discipline, really clashes with some of the direct action tactics we see sometimes. The sources mention things like activists gluing themselves to things or throwing soup at paintings.
Right. And while the motivation behind those acts might be understandable or even admirable, the Marxist critique is that they're fundamentally individual or small group protests. They're expressing outrage, maybe disrupting things.
But not building mass power.
Exactly. They tend to bypass the hard work of organizing the working class as a collective political force, which, according to this view, is the only force strong enough to actually challenge and defeat the organized power of the capitalist state. The fight is seen as fundamentally political and class-based.
This whole argument about means and methods, it's not new at all. Let's bring in Friedrich Engels and his famous piece from way back in 1872 on authority.
Ah, yes, essential reading for this debate. Engels basically took the anarchist call for abolishing all authority immediately, political, economic, everything, and just asked, how would that actually work?
Especially in a complex society.
Right. The anarchists were demanding the state be abolished instantly, even before the underlying conditions that created it at class divisions, the sort of chaos of capitalist production, were gone.
And Engels didn't just talk politics, did he? He used practical examples.
He did. He famously asked, how do you run a factory? Or a railway? Or coordinate a ship at sea without some form of authority, some coordination, some decisions being made and followed?
Even in a socialist society, you'd need coordination.
You'd need organization and, yes, authority in the sense of agreed-upon plans and direction to manage complex production. Otherwise, nothing gets done efficiently.
And that leads him to that really stark definition of revolution itself.
It's quite provocative. Challenged about needing authority, Engels basically says, look, a revolution is certainly the most authoritarian thing there is. He goes on, it is the act whereby one part of the population imposes its will upon the other part by means of rifles, bayonets, and cannon authoritarian means, if such there be at all.
Wow. So the point wasn't that authoritarianism is good, but that in a life-or-death struggle against a powerful enemy.
You have to be more organized, more decisive, more authoritarian in that specific sense than your opponent if you want to actually win and change things.
And does this perspective on needing organized, decisive force also explain the Marxist stance against individual acts of terrorism? Sometimes these things get lumped together.
Yes, there's a clear distinction made. Socialism, the sources argue, has to oppose individual terrorism, not necessarily on purely moral grounds, but on strategic and political ones.
How so?
The term liberals with bombs is sometimes used dismissively in the sources. The idea is that isolated acts of violence, even by people with revolutionary intentions, actually distract from the main task, building mass, conscious, working-class organization.
And it can backfire politically.
It often does. It can alienate potential allies, provide excuses for state repression, and generally play a reactionary role within the broader movement. The sources mention the context around Benazir Bhutto's assassination as an example of how such acts don't lead to genuine class emancipation.
Okay, let's shift to the history itself, because these weren't just abstract debates, they led to bitter splits. The big one early on was Marx versus Bakunin in the First International.
Right, this is really where the two currents formally diverged. Bakunin, probably the most famous anarchist thinker of that era, accused Marx and his supporters of being inherently authoritarian.
Because they advocated for political parties, for trying to win political power.
Exactly. Bakunin warned this would just lead to a new elite, a red bureaucracy, replacing the old one. And, that criticism has stuck. It's very common to hear Marxism painted as the source of all authoritarian tendencies on the left.
But the sources you looked at offer a counter-argument, kind of turning that critique back around.
They do. There's an interesting observation that sometimes the people shouting the loudest about authoritarianism can end up being quite authoritarian themselves when they actually gain influence or control, even on a small scale.
Interesting. So the charge of authoritarian can sometimes be a way to avoid the difficult questions of organization and leadership.
That's the suggestion, that it can become a convenient way to dismiss the need for disciplined, mass political organization, which is, let's face it, hard work and requires structure.
And this tension didn't go away. Decades later, you see Lenin and the Bolsheviks constantly battling tendencies they called ultra-left.
Constantly. These were groups who often shared the socialist goal but refused to engage with the messy reality of politics. For example, after the 1905 revolution in Russia failed and things got tough.
When the revolutionary mood died down.
Right. Lenin argued forcefully that the Bolsheviks, the Revolutionary Party, still had to participate in things like elections, even to the Tsar's rigged parliament, the Duma, and work inside the existing, often conservative trade unions.
But why? If those institutions are flawed, part of the system you want to overthrow, why get involved? Seems counterintuitive.
Lenin's argument, laid out in his book Left-Wing Communism and Infantile Disorder, was basically, you have to go where the masses are. If workers are in unions, you go there. If they pay attention to elections, you use that platform.
To do what? Win seats?
Not primarily, but to connect with workers, to explain your ideas, to expose the system's flaws, and, crucially, to build the party's influence and prepare people for future struggles. If you don't, you just become an isolated sect, talking only to yourselves.
So it's about staying connected to the actual working class and using every available platform, however compromised.
That's the core of the Bolshevik approach, the need for a disciplined party that can navigate both periods of revolutionary upsurge and periods of quiet preparation. And that's a fundamental break from anarchist approaches that often reject any participation in state structures.
There's a great historical moment that seems to capture this difference perfectly. When Lenin met the famous anarchist thinker Peter Kropotkin in Moscow. This was in 1919. Right in the thick of the revolution and civil war.
Yes, a fascinating encounter. Lenin apparently had a lot of respect for Kropotkin, especially his book on the French Revolution, and sought him out. Kropotkin was an old man by then, highly revered.
But struggling to apply his ideas to the reality of a revolution under siege.
That seems to be the crux of it. According to the accounts, Kropotkin in 1919 was really focused on local initiatives, setting up cooperative projects, mutual aid networks, important things, sure, but very localized.
A base building, essentially. Micro-level examples of a different society.
Right. And Lenin's reported observation was basically that Kropotkin had kind of lost the general picture. He was focused on these local projects while the Bolsheviks were desperately trying to hold on to state power, fight off foreign armies, and manage a nationwide crisis.
It really highlights that strategic difference. Focus on immediate, local, non-state solutions versus prioritizing the large-scale political and military struggle for overall power.
Absolutely. One is focused on the macro-level seizure and defensive power needed to survive, the other on the micro-level prefiguration of the future society.
And that harsh reality of survival leads us to those really contentious historical events often used against the Bolsheviks' Kronstadt, the conflict with Makhno's anarchist forces in Ukraine.
Yeah, these are always brought up as definitive proof of Marxist authoritarianism betraying the revolution. Huge controversies, surrounded by a lot of myth.
And the sources suggest that newer historical evidence complicates that simple narrative.
They do. The claim is that as Soviet archives opened up much later, the material actually tended to support the explanations Lenin and Trotsky gave at the time. For Kronstadt, for instance.
The Sailors' Rebellion in 1921.
Yes. The argument is that while fueled by genuine grievances, famine, war weariness, it was also exploited by counter-revolutionary forces, and its demands, if met, would have essentially disarmed the revolution at its most vulnerable moment. The anarchist approach in that specific brutal context was seen by the Marxists as unworkable against organized counter-revolution.
Okay, so pulling all this together for someone listening today.
Right.
We've talked theory, the state, property. We've talked methods, mass organization versus direct action, authority. We've looked at historical clashes. What's the core takeaway?
I think it really boils down to this. Marxism emphasizes a scientific historical analysis. It sees the need for a disciplined, centralized revolutionary party, the Bolshevik model, to win political power and then use a temporary worker state to defend that revolution against capitalism.
While anarchism prioritizes.
The immediate abolition of all authority. The focus is often on building alternatives from the ground up, base building, direct action, rejecting engagement with state power almost entirely. The Marxist counter is, that's necessary, but you first have to win the political battle against the capitalist organized power.
And importantly, the sources stress this isn't just some dusty historical debate. It becomes relevant again and again.
Absolutely. The argument presented is that whenever the class struggle heats up globally, and the sources, even from 2012, were already talking about a global crisis of capitalism, these fundamental questions about how to fight, how to organize, inevitably come back to the fore.
Which sets up our final thought for you, the listener. If we accept the premise from the sources that we're in a period of crisis, that history is maybe accelerating, what's the real trade-off?
Yeah, what's the most effective path today? Is it the disciplined fight to win state power, acknowledging the need for authority and organization to defeat the existing powers? Or is it the fight to immediately abolish all state power through more localized, direct means?
A choice with massive implications for how you think change happens and what you do about it.
Definitely something to chew on.
A challenging question indeed. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll catch you next time.